so much. So again, thank you to grant me this interview. That's a great privilege for us and for all viewers on Nuréa TV. Thank you again, Professor.
No problem. Thanks for having me. What I'm working on is trying to understand the nature of time and causality, especially through the violation of causality. So time and causality, I think, are two concepts in physics that are not well understood. And in fact, we have two major theories that are the most fundamental theories in physics right now. One of them is general relativity, and the other is quantum mechanics. And these are the theories that we use to understand everything in the universe, from the smallest particle to the largest galaxy. And both of these theories describe time in a very different way. So that's one problem, is that we don't have just one way to describe time. We have two fundamental ways to describe it. But more than that, we don't really understand what really is time. According to general relativity, it is a fourth dimension of space-time. But you can move in both directions in the space dimensions, but for some reason you can only move in one direction in the time dimension. And of course, there are some mathematical reasons behind that, and there are some more profound physical reasons that you can find, like entropy and stuff like that, which I won't go into right now because this is supposed to be a short introduction. But the point is that we don't fully understand how time works. And I think one way to understand how time works is to understand what happens when you break time, for example, through time travel. So if time travel is possible, or if it is not possible, we don't know. But first of all, the answer to the question, is time travel possible, would teach us a lot about time. And second of all, if we assume time travel is possible, and there are ways to formulate time travel, at least mathematically, in these fundamental theories that I mentioned, then by studying these by studying the consequences of time travel, that might teach us a bit about how time works, even if time travel is not possible. So that is essentially what I'm working on, is trying to understand time, understand causality, by looking at cases where causality might be violated, where you can travel back in time.
Thank you so much, Professor. For us, our viewers, real beginners in the matter, how would you describe in a simple way time and space, the main field you are working on, please?
So general relativity is the theory that describes space and time in the most fundamental way. And according to that theory, there are 4 dimensions in the universe. There's 4 dimensions of space-time, 3 of space, 1 of time. And the important thing about that is that these are not completely independent. You can actually rotate one into the other. So you can, of course, you can rotate space into space. Like if you have, let's say, the X and Y directions, and then you make a rotation, then of course you mix X and Y. So just by doing this, I'm now doing a rotation in space. But it turns out that you can actually also rotate space and time together. So you can mix space and time. You can perform something like a rotation. It's not exactly a rotation, but it's very similar to a rotation in, let's say, the x and t axis. So in one of the space axis and the time axis, you can make a rotation in that space and essentially mix space and time together. And that is where these weird relativistic effects that you may have heard of, like time dilation, come from. Time dilation essentially means I am converting some space into time, or vice versa, if you want to think about it in that way. So that means that this four-dimensional space-time isn't just enumerating all the dimensions. It's actually a structure where you can combine any two dimensions together, including the dimension of space and time. So in other words, you can say that time is kind of made of a similar thing to what space is made of in some sense.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really clear, and it's amazing because as you describe it, we can understand that reality as it appeared to us is just a representation of things, and the theory you are working on makes things really weirder, even a bit sci-fi, if you allow me.
Maybe a bit sci-fi-ish, but I would say any sci-fi is just science that hasn't been developed yet.
Thank you. And so, as you say at the beginning of this interview, you told us you were working theoretically on what could be time travel. Can you explain, maybe again in a simple terms, what is a time travel, please?
So, yeah, so I mean, first of all, just to make it absolutely clear, I'm not making a time machine or anything like that. I'm working on the theoretical consequences of time travel if it was possible. And in that, in this particular work, the way that I define time travel is traveling back to the past. So a lot of times people tell me, oh, but you can also time travel into the future, for example, by taking advantage of the effect of time dilation that I mentioned before. So theoretically, yeah, if you travel very fast, or you go and stay close to a black hole for a while, then time will pass faster for you than it will for other people. So theoretically, you can travel to the future that way. But what I usually say is that, first of all, this isn't any different than just sitting on your chair and not doing anything, because then you also travel to the future. Maybe you just travel a bit slower. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, well, if you travel to the future, you're not really doing anything interesting in terms of causality. You're not breaking any rules. So I define time travel as travel to the past, because if you travel to the past, then you can break causality. You can make changes to the past so that you could perhaps create a time travel paradox, or you can just change history from what you remember.
Okay.
Now, if you want a more technical definition of time travel, in physics, we call it a closed causal curve, or sometimes a closed time-like curve. And what that means is that in that space-time that I defined before, so this four-dimensional space, you have this closed curve, or in other words, a loop, where I start here and I go to the future, and at some point I turn back and go back to the past, and I end at the same point I started from. So that's why it's a loop, because I start and end at the same point. And according to my perspective, everywhere on this loop, I'm going to my own future. But in the global perspective of space-time, I am actually, at least for some of that loop, I am traveling back in time. So if I can get back to the point where I started from, that means I traveled back in time. That's how we define it in more precise terms.
Okay, thank you so much. It's very clear. We understand in a very practical way how it could work. And that's amazing because it opened really great, so to say, opportunity. And I want you to ask, not only as a scientist, but as a person, what can bring to humanity, if it's even possible, time travel?
You know, it's interesting because I don't know if this can actually bring anything to humanity, like you said, because sure, you can go back and you can kill Hitler, but if you really think about time travel paradoxes the way that I've been doing for the last few years, then you realize that, yeah, you can go back and kill Hitler, but by doing that, you will create a new world where Hitler is dead, but then the world you came from, Hitler was still alive in that world. So in that sense, you could perhaps undo very great evils in the past, but you can only do that by creating a new world. You can't do it in the existing world. And I think that's where a lot of sci-fi stories, you know, books, movies, TV series, and so on, that's where they all get it wrong. And that, yeah, you can go back and change history and make it better, but you won't make it better for people who have already lived that history.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you so much. So to precise what you say, which is very interesting and relevant, as you say, time travel could result in paradox, and such paradox could in fact not solve our problem, but so to say create new one. But in fact, it's creating alternative reality. Is that what you are saying?
So to be more precise, first of all, the notion of a paradox, again, this is something where I think a lot of sci-fi gets it wrong, is a paradox isn't something you can create. So in that sense, it's not something that is like, oh, I can go and create this paradox and create a problem. A paradox simply shows us that there is something inconsistent about our theory of physics. So usually in physics, when you discover a paradox, that means your theory is just not correct and you need to replace it with a better theory. So time travel paradoxes, and let me maybe give an example for people who are not familiar. So let's say I build a time machine and then I go into the time machine. I travel, let's say, 10 minutes to the past, and then I destroy the time machine. Okay, if I destroyed the time machine, then now I cannot go into the time machine 10 minutes later. If I cannot go into the time machine, then I cannot go back in time and destroy the time machine. Therefore, it is not destroyed, so then I can go into it and go back 10 minutes in the past and destroy it. So in other words, I both went back and did not go back, or the time machine has been destroyed and not destroyed, or it is destroyed if and only if it is not destroyed. And that is where the paradox is that essentially you can define it as the chain of events that led to time travel being possible has been undone by the act of traveling back in time. So that is called the consistency paradox. And a consistent paradox isn't something that can actually happen because it's just impossible. If I actually build a time machine and I go into the time machine and I travel 10 minutes back and destroy the time machine, well, then I won't be, breaking the space-time continuum or creating a huge explosion or all those things that you always see happening in sci-fi movies when people create paradoxes. This is just something that cannot happen in the first place. So the fact that this is something that seems possible just means that we don't fully understand how time travel works, and if time travel is incorporated into a fundamental theory of physics like general relativity or quantum mechanics, then it means that that theory is not complete. You need to improve that theory in order to resolve these time travel paradoxes. So that is, I think, maybe the most common misconception about time travel paradoxes is the fact that they exist doesn't mean that they can actually happen and will cause problems. It really means that they just show us that we don't fully understand the physics behind time travel. And that's where I come in, where I try to understand the physics behind time travel and try to maybe improve our understanding of physics by finding a way to resolve these paradoxes and make the theory consistent even in the presence of time travel. I'm not saying that time travel is possible. I'm just saying if it was possible, there would be these paradoxes in our theories, and therefore we need to find a better theory to resolve those paradoxes. But I'm definitely not saying anything whatsoever about whether time travel is actually possible.
Okay, thank you. That's really clear. I would like to ask you, maybe I'm wrong and maybe I'm not that well informed, but I've read that, not really sure in what kind of context, that if time travel are really possible, that we need a new kind of energy. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's part of most of the sci-fi culture, so to say. And this new energy, you think that we can maybe discover it nowadays or in next generation?
So what you're referring to might be to negative energy. So there is this, let's say, it seems like in physics, more precisely in the context of general relativity, which is our theory of space-time, it seems that if you want to travel faster than light, you would need some matter with negative energy. And the reason is that in general relativity, we know that matter and space-time interact. So if you have matter in a specific configuration with a specific amount of energy, that influences the curvature of space-time. Okay, so space-time can be curved. It has, maybe you can think of it as it has a certain shape, or it has bends and curves that you can kind of climb on top of, or something like that. And this space-time curvature indeed is exactly what is responsible for gravity. So if you have, let's say, a planet or a star, this planet or star has a lot of mass, and this mass creates curvature in space-time, and it can essentially fall into that curvature that it created, and that's where gravity comes from. So in order to travel faster than the speed of light, which, to be clear, is definitely not possible as far as we know, but it seems like it could perhaps be possible using some loopholes in general relativity. And if you wanted to do that, all the ways that we currently know of how to do that involve using matter with negative energy to create a very special kind of curvature that will then allow you to travel faster than the speed of light. Now, this matter with negative energy, sometimes we call it exotic matter. And the thing about faster than light travel is that it seems to be connected to time travel in the sense that if you can travel faster than light and you can do it fast enough and for a long enough period of time, then you can use it to travel back in time. Essentially, you can use it to create these closed causal curves that I mentioned before. So in that sense, I think it seems that perhaps matter with negative energy would be needed for time travel, but there's no proof that that is actually true. So in other words, first of all, there's no proof that you actually need matter with negative energy to travel back in time. And second of all, there's no proof that if you had matter with negative energy, you could actually use it to travel back in time. So that is another one of those things that are not well understood, and I actually have a student right now trying to understand it a bit better. So, you know, this is an area of open research, so I can't really I can't really answer the question because I don't know the answer. So it might be that time travel requires some special type of matter, or maybe not. Also, I will add that you can create negative energy. You can essentially make any matter into exotic matter if you take advantage of some weird quantum mechanical effects. So if you know the uncertainty principle, that in the most famous formulation says that essentially you can't know precisely your position and your momentum at the same time. You can think of kind of an analogy of that, which is not about position and momentum, but about time and energy. And there's I'm not going to go too much into it because it becomes a lot very technical, but essentially you can formulate this inequality that tells you that you can have negative energy for a certain amount of time, and essentially that comes from the fact that you don't know exactly how much energy you have, so maybe it's negative. And I know that sounds a bit stupid, but you can make it precise. So you can use essentially any matter that you want under very, very special circumstances, kind of extract negative energy out of it. But so far it seems that you can only do this for a very short amount of time, and you can only have very little negative energy, not in an amount that is actually enough to actually travel faster than light or go back in time.
Okay. Thank you so much for this really precise explanation, Professor. I will have, if you may, if you allow me, I have two questions, very theoretical, sorry, but do you think that for human body, is it possible to go through a time travel or not at all?
So there are some ways in which you could potentially travel back in time. At least we have the equations that perhaps could allow you to travel back in time. We just don't know if you can actually make these equations into reality. So one way in which you can travel back in time is using a wormhole. Essentially, you just have a hole over here and another hole over here, and they're connected. So you can go through one and come out through the other, and the other might be in the past. So in that sense, yeah, if you had a wormhole and it did indeed lead to the past, then you could travel through it with your human body, or presumably you would be inside the spaceship or inside something like that. But yeah, it would be possible if a wormhole was possible, which we don't know.
Okay, thank you. It's really a lot theoretical, but that's kind of a practice, and thank you so much to allow us to understand and to conceive in a much precise way how it can't be possible, because we are full of sci-fi representation, and it's hard to conceive how it's really for a researcher and professor like you to work on this kind of subject. Thank you so much for allowing that. And other question, if I may ask, maybe you won't think it would be relevant, but as a professor, as a scientist, do you think there is proof of any kind of time travel?
Proof? Like, what do you mean by proof?
An event, an experience, or whatever the nature of the fact is that allow you to think as a critical thinker and as a scientist that maybe it's a testimony of a time travel that occurred anywhere in history.
I don't think so, because let's say that, I don't know, someone comes to me and says, hey, I'm a time traveler, and then they predict, I don't know, stock prices for a week later or something like that. I would be much more inclined to believe that this person either had a very good guess or had some insider information than I would to believe that they're actually a time traveler, because it's predicting stock prices is very hard, but it's definitely much easier than traveling back in time. So, so I don't really think there's any kind of evidence that you could give me that would convince me that someone has traveled in time. I would probably first try to think of how to explain this without time travel.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking, in fact, I can't remember the famous scientist that attend just for fun as a time traveler party. Maybe you know this fun fact.
Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking had this party for time travelers, but it doesn't mean that if there were any actual time travelers, I mean, they didn't have to attend the party, right? So that doesn't really prove anything. I mean, I think Hawking said something like, time travel is impossible because otherwise we would see time travelers, but maybe time travelers exist, but they're just hiding. Like, why would they necessarily be advertising themselves? So I wouldn't take that as evidence against time travel, just as I wouldn't take someone claiming to be a time traveler as evidence for time travel.
Thank you so much. So time traveler may have to be discrete as the first order. It's the main point of being a time traveler, being discrete.
Definitely.
And I have another question, if you allow me. Your personal theory implying the nature of tachyon, can you explain just in a simple way to our viewer how is it linked to time travel, please?
So tachyons are hypothetical particles, and this is not my personal theory, just as what they generally are. Tachyons are hypothetical particles that always travel faster than light, and in fact, they cannot slow down to below the speed of light. And well, they're basically the opposite of a normal particle. So a normal particle, it has a state of being at rest, so moving at zero velocity, and then you can give it more energy and it will start accelerating. And as it approaches the speed of light, it needs more and more energy in order to accelerate. It would never, so it can go closer and closer to the speed of light. Let's say getting to 99.9999999% of the speed of light, and you can give it more and more energy, it will go to 99.99999999999% of the speed of light, and so on. But it can never get exactly to the speed of light, to 100%, because that will require an infinite amount of energy. For a tachyon, it's the opposite. Its state of rest, state of lowest energy, is actually traveling at infinite speed. And then as you give it more energy, it starts slowing down towards the speed of light. But again, it will need an infinite amount of energy to actually reach the speed of light. In this case, reach it from above. So it can get to like 100.0000001%, but it can never get down to 100% the speed of light. So this is something that mathematically exists in relativity, but we've never seen any proof that it physically exists in reality. And that is, I think, something that a lot of people maybe don't understand, is that if there's something in the math, that doesn't mean it actually exists in the physics. The math is a way for us to try to represent something physical in terms that we can deal with. But the fact that we can write down an equation or create a mathematical structure for something doesn't mean it necessarily has a physical analog. So personally, I would say there's the math for tachyons, but I don't think they exist in reality. However, I wouldn't rule it out because there's also no evidence that they don't exist. But it's just that if there's no evidence something doesn't exist, you shouldn't consider that as evidence for it to exist. So because tachyons travel faster than light, there is a connection between them and traveling back in time. Because like I said before, if you can travel faster than light, then you could use that potentially to travel back in time. And I think that's why in science fiction, you often see tachyons in connection with time travel. However, if you ask me what is the more realistic, and I'm using these quotes around realistic, and I just wanted to make note of that. So what is the more realistic way of time travel? I would say probably it's something like a wormhole rather than a tachyon.
Okay. Thank you so much for this precision. And if you allow me this last one question, if you agree, I want you to explain, our viewer, why did you get involved in time travel theory? How did it begin?
Well, I've always liked science fiction. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been fascinated by the idea of time travel, and definitely by time travel paradoxes, which, always blow your mind. And I was doing my PhD in quantum gravity, which is essentially the attempt that has so far not been successful to combine the theories of general relativity and quantum mechanics into one theory. And I was working on that. And while I was doing that, I was also reading up on a lot of other things. So if you work on quantum gravity, that means you have to understand perfectly both quantum and gravity. And that understanding allowed me to start thinking about lots of different things. And one of the things that interested me was the different ways in which time is represented in quantum mechanics and general relativity, like I mentioned I think in the very beginning. So that's one thing. And the other thing is there was a specific book I read, a very, very technical textbook called Lorentzian Wormholes by Matt Visser. And this book is, of course, about wormholes, and it's a very interesting read. And he also talks in that book about time travel and paradoxes and how they could potentially be resolved. And reading that, I think that was the first time when I actually realized that this science fiction stuff is actually something that physicists think about seriously and try to understand it. Maybe not all physicists. I think some physicists would see it as kind of a fringe topic, but it's definitely something that you can try to understand using all the tools available to you in physics and in math. So you can formulate the equations that allow you to travel back in time very precisely, and you can try to understand them using mathematical techniques, and you can use all the physics that we know, especially general relativity and quantum mechanics, and maybe in the future quantum gravity, if we ever actually find that theory. You can use it to understand these sci-fi topics. And I think that really was the first time that I thought this was actually something people are doing, and I started becoming interested in. And in the end, even though I did my PhD on quantum gravity, I decided after my PhD, I want to continue working on the topic of time and causality and study these topics, and in particular the science fiction topics of the possibility of faster than light travel and time travel, and the consequences like the time travel paradoxes, and just study them using all the math and physics that I learned during my PhD.
Thank you so much, Professor, for granting us this great and fascinating interview on this, as you say, the French topic. But it was really clear and really helpful. Thank you so much. I would like to remind viewers that the professor is own YouTube channel, and for English viewer, you can go on, or you can maybe try with subtitles, auto-generated subtitles, to hear more about what he has to say and how he explained in a very simple word what is time, what is space, and how time travel could be possible. Would you have anything to add, Professor?
I'm hoping to release a few new papers over the next few months. So, if you're interested in, if any viewers are interested in the more technical details of everything that I've been talking about, you can go on my website. It has a full list of my publications, and some of my publications that have already been published are about time travel and how to resolve time travel paradoxes in a precise way. And I have a few more publications coming up over the next few months. One of them is going to be presenting for the first time, as far as I know, a way to actually create new parallel timelines when traveling back in time. And there are some others that involve the possibility of faster than light travel. So, go to my website if you're interested, and you can read more about that.
Thank you so much, Professor, for letting us know.